looks like some rain could be in the forecast for the Canadian Grand Prix. Are we just hoping for bad weather at this point so that it could possibly disrupt or thwart Max Verstappen's dominance? Or is bad weather certainly something that could make this an interesting race?
No, it does feel like that, doesn't it? We had the last two races. So in Monaco, there was the rainstorm midway through, and it actually opened up an opportunity for Fernando Alonso genuinely to win that race, which won't happen in most places, because even if you get ahead during a rainstorm, Max Verstappen has a very fast car and can get back past you. Monaco is one of the tracks where it's so hard to pass that he may not have got past. He may have, I don't know. I mean, that's the most disappointing thing about that race, is that we never found out. Then in Spain, we had this threat of rain. I remember being on the grid. I took my rain jacket down to the grid. It was boiling hot, but I took my rain jacket down because there was these huge clouds in the distance, just over the final corner, hovering there. And some people were so convinced that there was going to be rain that George Russell radioed in saying that there was rain. In fact, it was sweat in his helmet. So yeah, it does feel like we're kind of almost relying on wet weather to spice things up a bit. The only thing to say about that is that often it's the case that the fastest car is also the fastest car in the wet, because it has the most downforce. It's the most well-balanced car. And that's the thing about this Red Bull, is that, you know, we look at other cars and they seem edgy, pointy, they're tricky to drive on the limit. The Red Bull is not tricky to drive on the limit, and yet its limit is higher than all the other cars. So if the rain fell, I would still be putting my money on Max, but it does open up all sorts of opportunities for other teams, and there's potential. Apparently it's in the air for Saturday, maybe for Sunday too.
If you knew it was going to be a downpour and maybe the Red Bull wasn't as dominant as it is this season, who would you draft as your driver to drive in wet weather?
That's a good question. I'd say Lewis is right up there in wet. But Max is too. I mean, Max is the kind of driver where if he was in a Mercedes or an Aston Martin and it started raining, and say Fernando and Lewis were driving Red Bulls, you might actually put your money on him. I mean, I remember in Brazil 2016, where he was just absolutely sensational in an inferior Red Bull and beat Nico Rosberg in the dominant Mercedes, just because the weather started falling. And he had this insane moment where he held a slide, went right up against the barrier. If you haven't seen it, YouTube it. Max Verstappen slide into Lagos wet weather 2016, and it was stunning. So Max, funnily enough, is one of the best drivers in the rain. Who else? I mean, like all the top drivers have it in their locker. So Fernando Alonso definitely as well. And really it's about that opportunity as well, making the most of conditions when they come in. And if you're a little bit further back, this is often cases where if you're the chasing car, you're wanting wet weather because you're willing to take some risks, where if you're the leading car, you really are balancing how many risks should I be taking, because is the car gaining on me behind and whatever, and you're so reliant on the engineer to tell you and feed you that information and find a sensible lap time to be hitting, because there's nothing worse than spinning out of the lead of a race in the wet, as Sebastian Vettel will tell you, because he did exactly that in 2011 in Canada, and Jenson Button won on the final lap, which was a sensational race. So hopefully more of that in Canada, but we'll see.
If fastest lap is at stake, you best believe, even if it's raining, Max Verstappen is going for it if he's got the lead.
I think he's addicted to fastest laps. I think he needs to go and see something about that, because he's absolutely obsessed with it. I mean, I guess when you're at the point where you're winning relatively easy, right? You've got to have something to entertain yourself. And that is, I mean, I say addicted, it's unfair, because it's just a characteristic of every single top racing driver, is that if there's an extra bit of performance on the table, or if there's an extra point on the table, they go after it. And that's why they are the best. It's just
no doubt. Yeah, he wouldn't be himself who he is today if he wasn't going for fastest lap, much to the chagrin of his team engineers. Describe the track and the racing that we normally see regardless of weather here in Montreal.
So it's quite a high-speed track. They'll be going well over 200 miles per hour along the long straights, but then it's got some very slow corners as well. So it's really about getting good traction out of the corners. That means you've got to look after the rear tires, and that makes it a very different circuit to the one we just left Barcelona, which was all about looking after the front tires, specifically the front left. Now, if you talk to people at Mercedes, that's one of their real strengths, is that when you've got to look after the front tires, their car is very fast. When you've got to look after the rear tires, not so much. So it's been said by a number of people going into this weekend that this is the real test of the Mercedes upgrades. We saw them make an apparent step relative to their fellow kind of best of the rest runners, Ferrari and Aston Martin in Spain, but can they keep that up in Canada? That will be a true test. It's a circuit that also creates quite a lot of drama. It's got the potential to create very exciting races. If you go back as far as 2010, there was a incredible race because the tires started falling apart. No one could manage the tires, and that actually set in stone the way that F1 expected its tire suppliers to create tires going forward. We talk about degradation in races. I know people get a bit bored about it, roll their eyes, yawn a bit, but it does often make exciting racing. And the idea behind creating these tires that struggle a little bit, that start to have different performance to the tires on another car, came from the 2010 Canadian Grand Prix, where we had a fantastic race because no one really knew what their 4 tires were doing underneath them at any point.
Everybody else, teams, driver-wise, who else are you kind of keeping an eye on storyline-wise and curious to see how they perform in Montreal?
I think Alpine are riding a little bit of a crystal wave after they got a boot up the backside from Laurence Rossi in Miami, where he kind of really went in hard on the team management and the way that team has been performing. And they hit back with a podium in Monaco and then a fairly solid result in Spain. And so 2 very different types of track, decent car. You hear increasingly the likes of Mercedes and Ferrari talking about the Alpines in conversations about where they are in the competitive order. They'll say, well, we're obviously against Aston Martin and Ferrari if it's Mercedes talking, but also we've got to keep an eye on Alpine. So I think they made a good step. And this is a track that I don't see any reason why it won't suit the car. But yeah, we'll have to wait and see. And then there's a number of ongoing stories up and down the grid, right? McLaren and can they turn it around this year? Looking increasingly like maybe not. The performance of the car isn't really where it should be. There's been mistakes. There's a lot of questions about that team going forward, and yet you've still got Lando Norris capable of doing qualifying performances like he did in Spain and putting it in the top 3, which was incredible. I mean, that whatever his pace rating is, I think it's 91 in the EA Sports ratings, pretty deserved on the basis of that. But yeah, it's a tricky time for them. So they'll also be looking just to get some good points on the board because if you look at the moment, if you're not basically Red Bull, Ferrari, Mercedes, Aston Martin or Alpine, getting in the points at the moment is quite difficult because if all those drivers finish of those top 5 teams, there are no points left on the table. So it's important for the other teams to take the chances where they can.
Beautiful bow, which means only one thing is left to do, and that is to make predictions. And as the poor host that I am, I forgot to text Nate Saunders and ask him for his predictions, but he is busy interviewing Daniel Ricciardo as we speak. So I wasn't expecting a text back, just a full disclaimer. You and I actually tied, if you remember from our predictions in Spain. You believed Max, Lewis, and Checo would be on the podium. I believed Max, Fernando, and Lewis would be on the podium. So you currently are at top of the table. 2 wins, 2 ties, 3 losses, which is better than Nate and I's current records. I will text him and I'll update us, obviously, when we reconvene next week afterwards to react to the Canadian Grand Prix. What is your predictions for this weekend?
So all I said about Aston Martin, I think it's a race where they bounce back. Now, just because I'm in the lead, I'm going to do the Red Bull thing and just be a little bit conservative. So I'm going to say Max Verstappen wins, Fernando Alonso second, Sergio Perez third. Just because I just feel like Perez hasn't quite got it together at the moment, and Fernando has had a fire lit underneath him ever since he underperformed at his home race.
I think that's fair. I'm actually going to just switch around my picks from 2 weeks ago. I'm going to go with Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton, P2, Fernando Alonso, P3. So he's back on the podium as he said he would be, but I'm going to go with option B, a little giddiness towards Mercedes. I'm going to be hopeful, but cautiously optimistic. We'll see.
Thanks so much for watching ESPN on YouTube. And for more sports highlights and analysis, be sure to download the ESPN app. And for premium content and live streaming, subscribe to ESPN Plus.